welcome to part 2 of our vertebrates lecture. We're going to continue with the tetrapods today. Before we get to that, let's review some of the features that we have learned already with the groups within the phylum Chordata. All right, so within our vertebrates, here with our hagfishes, we have the first of our vertebrates, and we have the development of the vertebrae feature or the backbone. And the vertebrae are segmented with individual muscles attached to each vertebrae, and the segmentation of our vertebrates allows for a more efficient swimming or movement in the water column. With our chondrichthyans, or the first of our gnathostomes, we get our first jaws. And with the jaws, we're going to get more efficient eating, which helps with a predatory lifestyle. In our, that would be right here. Right here within the ray fin fishes, for the first time, we're going to see a lung or a lung derivative. And within the ray fin fishes especially, that lung derivative is a swim bladder. And that swim bladder doesn't just allow for efficient movement laterally in the water column. What it allows for is that efficient up and down movement in the water column, controlled by the buoyancy. From when air inflates the swim bladder, it'll move up. When the air deflates from the swim bladder, the fish will move down. So we get more efficient movement within the water column there. With our tetrapods, which we are going to have next, we're going to have limbs with digits, and this is what will support weight on land. So that's where we are now. When we get to the amniotes, we're going to have an amniotic egg, which is a terrestrial adapted egg, and this allows for a full support of life in terrestrial ecosystems, not just living on land, but also reproduction on land. So let's continue with our tetrapods. In the introduction to tetrapods, let's just go over some of those key features. According to our previous slide, they share a common ancestor with the lobed fin fishes. So here's our lobed fin fishes right here. This would be the common ancestor between our lobed fin fishes and our tetrapods. Lobe fins, just to remind you, have a similar structure to the limbs of tetrapods, that being limbs with digits, and those limbs with digits have one bone attached to the shoulder joint or hip joint. Then we've got two bones, and then many bones. So this is what the limbs of all tetrapods look like. One bone, two bones, many bones. And these limbs are similar to what we see in the lobed fin fishes. And this right here represents a fossil that represents the common ancestor between the lobed fin fishes and tetrapods. All right, and in this fossil right here, you can see the structure of that fin has one bone. That's the shoulder. One bone, the humerus, two bones, and then many bones. So very similar structure to the tetrapod limb. But like fish, it had scales, fins, gills, and lungs. Other features that were similar to tetrapods in addition to the limb include a neck, which fish don't have, a head with the eyes on top of the skull, and ribs. That's another important one right there, a rib cage. All right. Within our tetrapods, our adults are going to use lungs instead of gills for gas exchange. even within the amphibians. So our groups of tetrapods include the amphibians and the amniotes, which are the reptiles and mammals. All right, this fossil right here was discovered in the Canadian Arctic fairly recently, in 2006. The name for this fossil was called Tiktaalik, and it's on display in the Field Museum, which is in Chicago. And I went to that museum in the last few years, and I found a picture evidence of that fossil right here. I was very excited to see it. Okay. So let's go to our first group of tetrapods, the amphibians. So key features of amphibians. They're always going to be found near water. So they'll be found in wet or damp habitats. They exchange, their respiratory system is gills in the larval stage and lungs in the adult stage. And many adult amphibians can also exchange gases directly through their skin. In terms of reproduction, eggs are going to be fertilized externally in water or onto moist land. So external fertilization outside of the body, even when you have a mating ritual, the female will release her eggs prior to them being fertilized. The eggs are moist and lack shells, so that's why they need water to be able to maintain viability. The number of eggs are usually associated with the amount of parental care that you find in that particular species. So if a species has a low amount of parental care, low care will result in a large number of eggs being laid. If the amount of parental care is high, then the number of eggs that are laid is usually a lot lower. All right, in terms of how the development occurs, early embryonic development and the development of the fetus is most of the time oviparous, which means that occurs in the egg. But there are some species, like this one over here, that are ovoviviparous, and that means the development is occurring inside the egg. You've got a little, I don't know how to draw a frog here, stick figure of a frog. You have a little frog developing within the egg, but the eggs are being held within the body of a parent, and that parent can even be the male parent. And so when birth occurs, the eggs hatch and those eggs are released from the body of the parent. So again, ovoviviparous means that the development occurs in the egg and the egg is inside the parent's body. Okay. The three orders of amphibians, so the phylum is Chordata, the class is Amphibia, the next level of taxonomic classification would be an order. So these three orders are Urodela, Aenura, and Apoda. And let's start with these ones that begin with the letter A. Apoda means no legs. And so these are going to be the Sicilians, which are legless amphibians. And they look a little bit like a snake, but snakes are reptiles that have scales. Amphibians, or Sicilians are amphibians, and they don't have scales. They belong to the class or the order Amphibia, class Amphibia. So Sicilians are legless amphibians. Aenura stands for tailless ones, so no tail. And this would be our frogs and toads that we see over here. So the order Aenura has no tails, and frogs and toads are very interesting in their adaptations. Their colors make them well adapted to escape predation, and many of them also have poisons that are excreted through their skin. Sometimes a frog will have the same color as a poisonous frog just so that predators are avoid wanting to eat it. So poisons and skin colors help frogs escape or evade predation. And then we have our salamanders. Salamanders have both legs and tails. They are called Urodela. So they don't have a lack of any particular body feature. So Urodela has tails and legs, and so that would be our salamanders. Okay, so before we move on to the reptiles and mammals, I'm going to give you all a bit of an introduction to the amniotes. The major thing about amniotes is that they are adapted to terrestrial ecosystems, not just because their limbs with digits support weight on land, like with the amphibians, but because of the amniotic egg, which is a terrestrial adapted egg. One of the main features that makes it terrestrial adapted is that it has a shell. So that's a key feature. Another feature of this amniotic egg is that they have 4 extra embryonic membranes. So what that means is here's the embryo right here developing within the egg, and we have 4 membranes surrounding that embryo and fluid within that membrane space. So counting from 1 to 4, we've got the amnion, which is the first membrane layer, the allantois, which is the second. Here's the allantois right here. The chorion is the third, and then the yolk sac will be the fourth. So let's explore the function of these 4 membrane layers and the fluids within. So the first was the amnion, and the amnion, since it's directly surrounding the embryo, it is going to be the membrane layer that is responsible for the protection or cushioning of the embryo. And the fluid within is called that amniotic fluid. The second right here, you can see it coming out. It's attached to the embryo. It's going to share part of its membrane with the chorion, but it's got blood vessels coming out, and these blood vessels are carrying metabolic wastes. So since the embryo can't just urinate into the egg, it doesn't necessarily urinate, it exposes its metabolic waste into the space within the allantois. So the allantois is the metabolic waste storage site. And now third, we've got our chorion. The chorion membrane layer shares space with the allantois, but then extends around the entire embryo and outside of the other membrane layers. And the chorion, along with the allantois, is involved with gas exchange between the embryo and the outside environment. And now finally we have our yolk sac, which contains yolk. And you can see blood vessels extending out, and this will transport all of the nutrients from the yolk into the developing embryo. So the yolk sac contains yolk and provides nutrients through the blood vessels to the developing embryo. All right, and then the fluid inside, of course, is called the yolk, which is the nutrients. And that's the 4 membrane layers. Another review term that we see here is albumin. We learned this way back in Unit 1. This stands for egg white protein, or that's what it is. Our first group of amniotes will be the reptiles. Before we get into the features of reptiles, I have highlighted on this phylogenetic tree the major clades and extant groups within those clades. Extant means they're not yet extinct, so they're still alive. And there are still living species within that group. So the first clade would be the archosaurs, and within the archosaurs we have turtles, crocodilians, and birds. So before DNA sequencing was common and widespread, birds were thought to be a separate class belonging to the class Aves. DNA evidence puts birds right in the middle of the reptiles. So not only are birds considered reptiles, if you look at this tree, you'll also see that birds are the only extant group of dinosaurs. The second major clade are the lepidosaurs, and within the lepidosaurs we have tuataras and squamates, which include both the lizards and snakes. All right, back up to the general features of reptiles. Most are going to be terrestrial, but of course there are some aquatic species like turtles. They use rib cage for the ventilation of their lungs, so a full rib cage to support breathing. Reptiles have scales covering their body composed of keratin. So keratin is a structural protein that we talked about in Unit 1. Like all of the animals or all of the vertebrates that have come before, like amphibians and fish, reptiles are ectothermic, which colloquially stands for cold-blooded. But they don't actually have cold blood. What ectothermic means is that their heat is obtained from the outside or externally rather than generated from within. And I say most are ectothermic, but not all. And I say not all because birds are going to be our exception, and birds are going to be endothermic, meaning they generate their heat from their own metabolism. Birds are going to be endothermic, and unlike the rest of the reptiles, birds will have a four-chambered heart. So other than birds, reptiles are ectothermic and have a three-chambered heart. Birds are going to be the exception. They are endothermic and have a four-chambered heart. As far as reproduction goes, eggs are fertilized inside, internally, and most species lay their eggs on land, and development occurs in that amniotic egg. So that means the development is oviparous, inside the egg. And of course, we've already covered what that amniotic egg looks like. It's terrestrial adapted because it has that hard shell to prevent it from becoming dehydrated. And it has everything inside in order to support growth and development of the embryo. As we go through some of the examples, we'll talk about some structural adaptations that allow for different lifestyles. Particularly, we're going to talk about snakes and predation, and we'll talk about birds and flight. All right. So, expanding on our groups within the reptiles. Our lepidosaurs, I called that the second group, but we're going to start with them. Lepidosaurs include tuataras and squamates. Tuataras are only found on the coastal islands of New Zealand. They're not found on the main island of New Zealand because all of the eggs were wiped out by rats. And on these coastal islands, there are only two species remaining. So two species of tuataras. They are considered, of all the extant species, they're the earliest diverging of all of our extant reptiles. So they're very ancient and they can live a very long life. Squamates include lizards like this gecko and also snakes. Okay, so snakes are highly adapted for predation. Instead of asking you all over video to come up with these examples, we'll just list them right here in this space. So We have chemical sensors. Snakes can sense chemicals rather than just smells. And they also have heat detecting organs, which will let them know if a warm-blooded animal is nearby, or an endotherm. Their bodies can sense vibrations on the ground. Of course, they're venomous, and they have those unhinged or those very loose jawbones that allows them to open up widely and eat prey that's larger than the size of its own head. Turtles are going to be one of our other groups of reptiles. I don't have much to tell you about turtles other than they have 307 species. They can range anywhere from tiny to very large. Sea turtles are going to be our largest turtle, up to 1,500 kilograms. They predate on jellyfish, but they can live in a variety of aquatic environments. Ponds, rivers, oceans, and also even deserts. So they can be terrestrial or they can be aquatic. And the key characteristic of turtles would be these two shells. This lower shell is softer, the upper shell is hardened, and this will protect against predation when they retreat into their shells. Crocodilians are our next group of reptiles. Crocodilians include both crocodiles and alligators, and both are found in aquatic or wet environments. There's only 23 species of all crocodilians. You don't need to know the number of species, but they differ in a couple of key ways. The way I like to think of it is I'd rather get stuck with an alligator than a crocodile. Alligators tend to be a little less aggressive. There are always exceptions, of course, whereas crocodiles are often more aggressive. The head shape is a little bit different. You can see here we've got a pointy head versus a very rounded head. Crocodiles have the pointy head. Alligators have the more rounded head. And their environments tend to be somewhat different. Alligators can live in marine environments, but sometimes they're found in brackish or even freshwater. And crocodiles tend to live in the saltier environments, so more likely to be found in marine or saltwater environments. Of course, there's going to be some overlap between these habitats and their shapes and their level of aggression, but those are just some general differences. Right. Finally, we have our birds. And our birds, again, are endothermic, so this is the exception to all of the other groups of reptiles. They're endothermic and they have a 4-chambered heart. So that means they have 2 atria and 2 ventricles to receive blood from the body and pump it to the lungs, and then another chamber that receives that blood from the lungs and then pumps it to the body. So that being said, the respiratory system of all reptiles is lungs. And birds are highly adapted to flight. This right here represents the osprey webcam that we have on campus. I'm not sure if that will be functioning this year, but each year we have a pair of osprey that come back to their nest, which is on top of a light pole in the parking lot of the Swan Building, and they lay their eggs and nurture their young from the late months of April usually until the end of the summer. So flight adaptations for birds. We've got many of them, and we'll split them up into metabolic versus weight-saving adaptations. So some of our weight-saving adaptations are the hollowed bones, or the bones with airy pockets. They're not truly hollow, they just have airy pockets. They don't have a bladder, and no bladder. And so they also don't form urine. They form something else called uric acid, which is a paste. So urine holds a lot of water. It's a water, urea is water soluble, and urine is how urea is stored in water in the bladder and is formed by the kidneys. Instead, they store their waste as uric acid, which is more of a hydrophobic paste, and then so it doesn't require water, and it's just eliminated from the animal. So this uric acid doesn't require water to store it. So they will carry less water weight. Right. They don't have any teeth and have very small gonads. Sometimes they'll have only one ovary. We'll just say reduced gonads. Of course, they lay their eggs, so they don't carry they don't carry their embryo with them. That's true of all reptiles, though. That's it for the weight-saving features. As far as our other features, of course, we've got wings, which are aerodynamic in their structure, and they have a keeled sternum, a very large curved sternum, and this allows for a lot of extra space for more muscle attachment. So more surface area for muscle attachment. Right. And their major metabolic feature is that they have a very high metabolism, so creates a lot of ATP. They have a very high metabolic rate, and in order to support this metabolic rate, they need a very efficient respiratory system, which we'll learn about in Unit 5, to provide the oxygen to support that metabolic rate. So they have a very efficient respiratory system and method of breathing. And of course, their four-chambered heart allows for a more effective blood flow. So the efficient respiratory system and the four-chambered heart help to support the higher metabolic rate. This picture right here shows you the structure of a wing in birds, and you can see that it still has that one limb, two limbs, and then, one bone, two bones, and many bone structure. Mammals are our last group, and we are going to cut our lecture on mammals short. We won't go over primates and human evolution. We're just going to focus on the three major groups of mammals, which are shown in this picture here to the right. The three major groups are monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians, with the eutherians being the most diverse, containing the most examples. So most mammals that we come across are in this group right here. So we'll discuss examples in these three groups, but first let's talk about our key features of mammals. So the first is that mammals produce milk. Milk includes the sugar lactose. Remember that lactose is a disaccharide made up of two monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. Milk is produced by mammary glands, so mammary glands will be found in all female mammalian species. Mammals are primarily terrestrial. There are exceptions, of course, like whales and dolphins. Mammals, unlike reptiles, don't have scales, so no scales. Instead, we have hair covering the surface of our body. All mammals are endothermic, which again means heat is generated from within. It's a byproduct of our own metabolism. We breathe through lungs fully, so that's similar to reptiles. And we have a four-chambered heart. All mammals have eggs that are fertilized internally. The development will differ depending on whether you're a monotreme, a marsupial, or a eutherian. So we're going to see differences in the development among these three groups. Our monotremes are the egg-laying mammals. So that means they are oviparous and development occurs in the eggs. The examples of monotremes include platypus and the spiny anteaters. So they don't have nipples, but the mammary glands are underneath the skin. Milk will be secreted through the glands onto the skin, and then the young just lap up the milk off the mother's belly. Our second major group are the marsupials, which include kangaroos, koalas, and opossums, and also possums. The only difference between an opossum and a possum is what continent they're found on. Opossums are found, I think, in North America, whereas possums are in Australia. I could have that reversed. All right, so those are the examples of our marsupials. In terms of development, it's partially going to be inside the mother's body and will be supported by a placenta. So they're only partially placental. And the placenta, of course, is the nutrient support within the uterus of a mammal for the developing embryo and fetus. So we're going to have partially placental development. And then the pouch is where development will be completed. So birth occurs very early on in the developmental process, and then the development will continue while nurturing in the pouch. So development is complete in the pouch. Which is one of the key characteristics of the marsupial, that pouch. And now finally we have our eutherians. And eutherians include the rest of us furry mammals. So any example of a furry animal that was not one that we've already talked about is likely going to be a eutherian. And these are the fully placental mammals. So the marsupials are the pouch mammals, the monotremes are the egg-laying mammals, and the eutherians are the fully placental mammals. So the development is fully viviparous, fully within the mother's body, and there's a live birth of a fully developed newborn. And so this will include our whales and dolphins, humans. This is the cast of the Jersey Shore. This is my dog Miley and my cat Casper. Big fan of cats. These are some cats. This is a cat that I rescued and gave birth in my garage as one of its little babies. And bats, of course, even though they're winged and they fly, bats are mammals, and you can see the fur here. And here we've got an armadillo. This figure in your book shows you more examples. Humans belong to the order of the primates. Humans, monkeys, chimpanzees, lemurs, gorillas, etc. are all share a common ancestor. But you could just look at this list for all of the other examples of a eutherian. Again, if it's a furry animal and it's not one of the examples we discussed as a monotreme or a marsupial, chances are it's a eutherian. That is all for Unit 4. We are going to have a review session next week at 11. So after you go through all of this and take your quiz, please come to that review session with any questions that you have. Have a great weekend.